everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I'm sorry I couldn't be live in this event, but unfortunately, because of the time difference between the UK and Russia, it was a bit complicated, but hopefully you enjoyed this presentation, and I can always answer to any questions you might have. At the end, you can email me, and I'll be happy to answer to your questions. So I was very happy to be invited to speak about industrial heritage, and I'm happy there's lots of people who's interested in this topic, like I am. Just to tell you a little bit about me, I am from Brazil originally. I now live in the UK, but I'm from Brazil. So I've graduated in architecture in Brazil. I moved to Italy to do a master's degree in building conservation. So I've always worked with building conservation with churches, so even in Brazil, then when I went to Italy. Then I moved to London after my master's to work with conservation as well. And then during that time where I was living here in London from 2012 to 2015, I lived in a former military neighborhood here in London, and I lived in an industrial building that has been converted into housing, into residential units. And when I went back to Brazil in 2015 to teach, so I went back there to teach architecture, and I lived there for 4 years before coming back here to the UK. I was very sad to see, you know, the way Brazil was dealing with industrial heritage. So we have buildings that are very similar to the buildings that they convert into housing here in the UK. So, you know, like these buildings here, they're beautiful buildings. They are listed. So, you know, they are considered heritage. Their value is recognized through listing, but we just don't use them. So they are like this, you know, so, degrading every year. They've been unused for like 20 years, and we don't do anything with them. And this made me really sad, you know, because I was living in the UK, because I could see how they reuse here in the UK, how they reuse their industrial buildings, especially for residential purposes. And I was interested in, you know, finding out what were we in Brazil doing wrong, and what the UK does, and how can they convert these buildings into, you know, daily life uses, and why couldn't we in Brazil? And I think that you have, you know, similar problems in Russia. I've never been, so I don't know much about it, but I think, you know, I wanted to, while I'm talking about Brazil and the UK, I want you to think about what you do in Russia. And I think we might find, you know, the same problems. So again, these are all listed buildings in Brazil, industrial buildings with no use, because of course the government doesn't have money to do anything. These are all private buildings. And the public, the private sector, they don't have interest in converting this building. So this is not a common practice in Brazil. So we don't do this. So the market is not prepared for that yet. And also people don't see themselves living in these places. Like here in the UK, it's really common for people to live in industrial buildings. So these are, you know, examples. So if you walk in London, you always see industrial buildings that today are being used as housing. So here are some examples, and not only housing. So this is a very new development in King's Cross. They've converted all of this, you know, former industrial neighborhood into a university, shops, and then of course with new housing as well, as you can see in this image here. Lots of new buildings, and then, you know, in the same place as the old ones. And then there's another one which is very new. I took these photos a month ago. So this is the Battersea Power Station. I'm sure you've seen this building in the cover of Pink Floyd's disc. So this building is being converted, the building itself is being converted into a shopping center, and there's lots of new buildings around it, and some new houses as well on the top. So this is an image of the of the project, some renders. So this is how it's going to look like from the inside, and this is the whole thing. And I'm not saying this is the perfect thing to do, and I have some critics about this project, but still, what I want to show you is how the UK really keeps this heritage alive by giving new uses, and they've been doing this for many years, and they still do it. So this is another example, another power station, Lost Road power station. They are converting it to housing as well. It's very impressive if you look on Google Maps. You see, that in the inside there's nothing there left, and they're gonna convert everything into new housing. And of course, a very important and one of the first examples here in the UK is the Tate Modern Museum. So again, another power station that's been converted into a museum. So I started my research, my PhD research. Sorry, I forgot to say that I'm doing a PhD research at the University of São Paulo, where I'm researching about the adaptive reuse of industrial buildings to residential purposes. So I was wondering, my first questions were, why can't we in Brazil preserve and develop at the same time? Why do we need to, we either list building and then don't touch it, or we demolish and rebuild? Why can't we, do what the UK does? And then one of the things that I always thought was a problem is that industrial heritage is still not very easily recognized as heritage in Brazil. So not too many people see. So in Brazil, we have our Portuguese colonial architecture that is the most, valuable. This is what we see as heritage in Brazil. So lots of other buildings, like, modern buildings and industrial buildings, it's not very easy to tell people why it is important. People don't really understand. And then, so we still have lots of demolitions of industrial buildings. Is the most common things to do. So we list our industrial buildings, but the most common thing to happen is the demolition of these buildings to build residential buildings in the same place. So this is why it's so intriguing. Like we keep demolishing our buildings that could be converted into housing to build housing. So and when we list a building, and we find another use to this building, we usually convert it to cultural purposes. So listed buildings in Brazil are usually converted into museums or, cultural centers, exhibition centers. It's not common for us to reuse listed buildings to do, daily life activities like housing and commercial uses and services. But I think the main problem is that we don't combine industrial preservation to urban planning. So it's two separate things. So the city does all their planning policies, and then the preservation body do their policies, and they don't talk to each other. And this is what I think is one of the main reasons why the UK gets to reuse their buildings, is because they really combine their urban policies with preservation. And also when they talk about preservation, actually we don't talk about preservation here in the UK. The word we use is conservation, and the English Heritage, which is the preservation body in the UK, in England, they say that conservation is the process of making change to a significant place in a way that it best sustains its heritage values, while recognizing opportunities to review or reinforce those values. So they say that conservation is to manage changes. So they know that when you conserve a building, when you do any intervention in a building, you are going to make changes. And I think even though when we study conservation, we know that we need to do some changes. But when it comes to approving a projects, many of the technicians who usually, approve or not the projects, sometimes they don't understand, and they think nothing can be done with the building, you can't change anything. And then really to convert it to housing, it's really hard to do it without changing or adding something to the building. So I think this is an understanding they have here in the UK that really helps converting these buildings. So to talk very quickly about what they do here in England, so the history of heritage and urban planning. So the most important thing, this awareness of the value of these industrial buildings. Let me just move this here. So it started in the 19th century, so with John Ruskin and William Morris. So they're still very, strong here. Their thoughts, and this is why they don't talk about preservation here, because preservation really brings them to Ruskin's thought that you can't really touch the building. So after the 19th century, they've kind of divided the history of preservation in three different moments. So the first one, the focus was in the monuments, second one in the buildings, and then the third one, the conservation areas. So in the first moment, so when they started to really talk about conservation, the focus was monuments, so big and very important buildings, mostly ecclesiastical, so churches and cathedrals. They would repair them as found without adding anything, without changing the use, still with a very strong influence of Ruskin, so minimum intervention. They wouldn't do much about these buildings. But then in the beginning of the 20th century, and especially after the war, when they had to rebuild lots of things and they were demolishing lots of things, they've realized there were too many post-medieval buildings that would need protection. But then, that approach of minimum intervention wouldn't work for them. So they've started to enlarge, say, this preservation policies to focus on all of the buildings. It doesn't have to be a very monumental and important building. So all of them would need protection. And that's when they started to join urban planning to heritage. So the first legislation that considered building heritage into planning was this Town and Country Planning Act so it was in 1932. So this was the first one, and then ever since they've always considered heritage into urban planning. So these planning documents, their role was to balance the public interest of conserving these buildings and making them preserving them for future generations, and so to balance this interest to the interest of the private sector, who of course they would want to make more changes, and so they need to balance this all of these interests of everyone who's involved with the areas to be preserved. And then from the 60s or 70s, they've realized that you can't really think of each individual building, so you need to think about the whole area where they are. So it doesn't make too much sense to just preserve one or two buildings and then demolish all of the rest. So in 67, they've started the conservation areas, which, we have this in Brazil as well, but it's not as strong as here. And I don't know if you have that in Russia. But here, so most of the industrial buildings, they end up being preserved through conservation areas. So they don't list each individual building, but they say, all of this area is a conservation area. So we need to think carefully, about what we're going to do with these places. And then today, so since 2012, there's one policy, so the National Planning Policy Framework. It replaced all of the other documents. Then everything all of the decisions are based on this document. And what's very important here in the UK is that the decisions are made locally. So like in London, there are 32 boroughs, and then so there's not one, council in London that is going to authorize all of the projects. Each one, so it's by neighborhood. So everything is made locally, so they can, check with the community, see what they want, what their interests are. So there's this kind of regeneration that's called heritage-led regeneration, which puts the heritage in the first place. So let me move this again. The bottom line is that to preserve a building is not only to list. So it's not the only way we can preserve buildings. It's not by listing only. And to renew is not to demolish. So you can renew or regenerate a neighborhood without demolishing everything. So we can preserve and develop at the same time. So this is what they do here. So they preserve, but they do new buildings in the same context. They preserve, but they adapt the building as well, so that it continues in the daily life of the city. So they preserve, but they keep this urban vitality, and they live in these buildings. They keep these buildings alive. So I want to show you very quickly. This is one of my case studies in my PhD. This is the neighborhood of Royal Arsenal in Woolwich. So this is a district of Royal Arsenal in the neighborhood of Woolwich. So just for you to, I don't know if you've been to London, but this is Hyde Park. This is where Westminster is, and this is where the city is. Canary Wharf, which is a very important and well-known case. This is the London City Airport. So Woolwich is here, so to the east of London. Woolwich was a former, so it was an industrial site. They produced most of the ammunition that the UK used in the First War. So it is like a very of a very national importance. And of course, all of this site after the Second War, they started to close, and then in the 60s, it really closed down. So all of these sites remain there without any use. Today there are 22 listed buildings in this site, and the whole site is a conservation area. But it is a conservation area, but it doesn't mean that you can do anything with that area anymore. So because London is growing population again, and lots of places in London are regenerating to receive more housing, so that we can receive more people in London. So this is one of the places where they looked and said, okay, this is a good place to build more housing. So since the year of 2000, they've started to redevelop all of this area. It's almost completely finished now, so 20 years later. So this is a regeneration that took more than 20 years. So this is just for you to see. So there are buildings from the 18th century to the 19th century. Some are, grade 1 listed, very important. Some are grade 2 star. Some of the buildings have been demolished. Even before they started the regeneration, many of the, not very important buildings have been demolished. And this is what they have now. So they've converted many of the buildings into housing, but they've done museums as well, shops. They've built more houses. And this was a partnership between the public sector. So the public sector owned this place, and they sold for nothing to the private sector, so to Berkeley Homes. They are the private sector involved in this project, and they've been building this together, with this relationship. That was a very nice relationship, actually, because in the beginning, when they started so in the year of 2000, when they did the first master plan, the master plan is what they call here an outline application. So it's a very flexible master plan. So they say, here's going to be residential, here's going to be leisure, and it's going to be industrial, but they don't really, it's not very detailed. So they approve this master plan, and then, every year they go and talk again and see the plans in more detail, and then they approve again and again. So this is what they've done here. So they had to approve this flexible master plan in the beginning, so they would have time to engage the private sector. So of course the public sector wanted to make this an attractive place so that the private sector would come and regenerate. So this is also something that, in Brazil, we still don't do that too much. So the private sector are not interested in regenerating. So all they want is a clear land to build. And here this is very common now for years. So of course the preservation body, so English Heritage, and the Greenwich Council, which is the local council here, they had to develop confidence in one another. So imagine to approve a plan that is not very detailed. So they had to build this confidence, and they had to balance, what they would change and where they would, what they would demolish. So it had to be a balance, because it had to be good for either, the private and the public sectors. So most of the buildings have been all partitioned in the inside, because it's really hard. The industrial buildings are usually really big. So there's not many uses that you can put in this building to keep it exactly as it was originally, with a very large plan, floor plan. So in most of the cases, they had to partition, put a new floor, put new walls. And then some of the buildings, the ones that are more important, they managed to keep in a very open plan, and they put some cultural uses in it. But most of the buildings are, like this. So, and the funny thing is that they kept the buildings very dirty. They didn't clean the buildings, but they did the conservation, because they wanted it to look, as if, they wanted people to remember that it was an industrial site, very dirty. So this is one of the most important buildings. They've converted it to housing. You can see here there's a new floor in between these very large windows. So the apartments are duplexes. They have two floors. In some of the buildings like this one, they've done a very big intervention, which is they've put 3 new floors on top. This is also something that unimaginable in Brazil. They will never allow these things. But this building here is not listed, and they would demolish this building. So in the first master plan, they've planned to demolish the building, but they kept it in place because of the addition of these 3 floors. So if it wasn't for these 3 floors, they would have demolished it, because it wouldn't have been worth it to preserve this building. So this is how it was, and this is how it became with the addition of the 3 floors. It's a residential building, and there's lots of new buildings, and you can see that how the new buildings, they they keep the same height, they keep the same kind of colors and textures, so they're not very different. It's something else that we have a problem in Brazil. We build always the same type of buildings, and they don't really match with the context. And here they really thought, how this would look between the old buildings. Behind this building here is where the conservation area finishes. So to the other side of the conservation area, they are building very tall buildings that doesn't look very good. Here I have some critics as well. And that's all a new place, actually, where those tall buildings are. It was supposed to be a park. But at the end, the private sector got approval to do that, because they were building a new train station in the neighborhood. So it was kind of an exchange. So, I'll build you the train station and you let me build this building. So, of course, there's lots of private interest in all of these. Of course, they need to make money, and so what the public sector needs to do is to manage, these interests. And then just to finalize, in what I think is really nice here in the UK is that everything goes through this planning system. So when you ask permission to demolish or to do an intervention or to, you know, just change the inside of a listed building, everything goes through these planning portals. So you go online, you do this application, and then you say, you know, this is a listed building, so I'm going to apply for planning permission and listed building consent. And then everything is done together. So in Brazil, if we need to approve something, we need to first get approval from the preservation body, and then we need to get approval from the municipality. And then this is where things get lost. And this is why the private sector is not interested in doing this kind of projects, in adaptive reuse projects, because it gets too complicated and it's really hard to get approval. Also, I think the architects in Brazil were not prepared to do projects in listed buildings. So it's really, I'm not blaming the preservation bodies in Brazil, because the projects are really bad sometimes. So they end up saying no to all of these projects because the projects are bad. But then, so the architects blame the preservation bodies because they never, you know, accept anything. But it's complicated. And this is something important that I wanted to tell you. It's not because the UK does it like that. So they engage the private sector, they work in planning. It doesn't mean that we in Brazil or you in Russia need to copy what they do. So this works here, and there's lots of other things behind it that, of course, I didn't tell you today. I'm researching for my PhD. So there's lots of reasons why the UK does it. And we can't, it doesn't mean that it would work in Russia or it would work in Brazil, because this case that I showed you, so Royal Arsenal here, there is also lots of problems here, especially with gentrification. So this part of the neighborhood that they've regenerated is today, it's very divided with the rest of the neighborhood. And it's becoming a problem now in the neighborhood because of this area. So it is gentrified, it's gentrifying the rest of the neighborhood. And there's lots of council houses there, and they are demolishing these council houses. So it does create a problem. In the UK, one very important thing that I forgot to say is that they have a policy where all of these developments, they need to give around 40% for affordable housing. But affordable housing, I don't know if you have that in Russia, but it doesn't really mean social housing. It's different. So it's a very small percentage of these 40% that really goes to like low income residents. So most of these places are, you know, it causes gentrification. So this is a problem that is still to be solved. So in a country like Brazil, this would be a very, very big problem, because we need social housing in Brazil in the city center, because we usually build social housing very far from the city. So it would be really nice to have these industrial buildings that are in the city center, you know, like the industrial buildings that I showed you in the beginning of this presentation. Let me just go back here very quickly. So these buildings here, they are in the city center, and you can see here the new buildings behind. This is the kind of new buildings they do, which doesn't really match with the industrial site. So it would be really nice if we could convert this into social housing, but then who's gonna do it? I mean, the government keeps saying they don't have money, and what they would need to do is to try and engage the private sector to do this. But still something, you know, I hope we'll get there someday, but it's still not happening. And then, so the other thing is about the adaptive reuse. This is something we don't talk about in Brazil too much, about adaptive reuse. So really, here, adaptive reuse is becoming kind of a new discipline apart from conservation. So they don't really talk too much about conservation of industrial buildings. They talk about adaptive reuse. This is another discussion. So in Brazil, we see if we're working with heritage, everything's inside the discipline of conservation, restoration, and it gets a bit complicated because it's a very specialized area, and most of the people don't really understand. So this is a problem as well. But one thing that I really like here, and I think we could do in Brazil, and maybe you can do it in Russia, I'm not sure. I really wanted to be live here at the moment so that you could tell me how you do in Russia. But the decisions are made locally. I think this is very important, that the decisions are made locally, because in Brazil, if a building is listed through the national preservation body, sometimes people who are judging, they're not local, they don't really know about that community. And I think it's really important to involve the community to really understand the building and the site. And I think it's really nice how they do everything locally, and all of the decisions are made together, you know, with the urban policies and heritage and the community. I think this is very, very nice. So thank you very much. This is a very complex topic, and I've tried to talk a little bit about what I'm doing on my research. I don't have all of the answers yet, and I don't know if I'll ever have, because I think the most difficult part is easy to, you know, see what they do here in the UK, but it's really hard to translate that into our reality in Brazil or into your reality in Russia. So these are things we need to discuss and research more, and I'll be happy to answer to any questions you have. You can email me on my university email, which is this one, and you can always you can also follow me on Instagram. I always post everything in Portuguese, but we have this translation thing on Instagram now. I don't talk only about industrial heritage on my Instagram. I talk about architecture and urbanism in the UK and in Brazil in general. So yeah, I'll be very happy to answer to your questions. Thank you very much. I hope you know, you also be able to find some answers to your cases in Russia. Thank you very much.